Hey, I'm making my own way, but I stumble and I falter every day. But I love my baby now. But I love my baby, I'm still learning how. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Stay with me. We'll beat these
Good afternoon. I'm Alicia Connors-Bauer with Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance, and I am your host today for today's Pathways to Parenting show on Oh No, a teenage brain has taken over my child. So with me today are two panelists, Dan Fox. Dan is a licensed professional counselor who has spent the past 15 years helping adolescents grow into healthy, happy adults. We're also joined by Carolyn Roy. Carolyn is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked with adolescents and families throughout her career. So I just wanted to add, if at any point in time you're watching the show live at home, you can go to the Boulder Psychological Services website at www.boulderpsychologicalservices.com to submit a question electronically. If you're here in the audience, please feel free to ask us a question. So one of the things I think it's important for us to talk about is really to set the stage for what are some of the changes in the brain that take place during adolescence. It used to be believed that the majority of brain development took place and was done by early childhood, but recent research is showing that that's actually not the case, that there's another developmental phase for the brain that occurs during adolescence. And it's an additional maturation process that the brain goes during these teen years. One of the areas that's really impacted by this developmental process is the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for high-level cognitive functions such as decision-making and planning, inhibiting inappropriate behavior and social interaction. One of the things this impacts is the ability to take into account someone else's perspective, because the brain is still developing, and so that changes as a teen moves through late adolescence. So one of the things that I wanted to start off with in asking our panelists is really if you could talk a little bit about what you see between the relationship between brain development and social emotional development in teens. Let's start with Dan.
Thanks. Hi, Lisa. So, boy, I think one of the big challenges that we have with the brain and social emotional development is that prior to adolescence, we have a relatively concrete way of understanding the world. So our social awareness is kind of simplified. We're having play dates set up by our parents and things like that. But when we can start to think more abstractly, when we can start to go, oh, what does he think of me? Or she walked past me and raised her eyebrows, and does that mean, like, I should say hello, or does that mean that I should just keep walking because she was sort of shocked at me in a disturbed way? And kids have to sort of interpret this stuff with a lot of extra thought going on, right? Our brain is starting to sort of rev up and move more quickly and conceptualize more things, so they've got more content to sift through, and there's this ability to actually hold abstract thoughts. So you can start to imagine what all these different people are thinking of you, and all these very complicated social triangles happen, and then people start texting each other like 3,000 times in a month, and we're like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? But what they're doing is trying to figure out how to sort of practice this newfound gain of abstract thinking. It works out in the social domain quite a bit. And they start to get this much better sense of who they are in terms of a social self, their sense of identity, their sense of self-esteem in a more complex adult way. And that also takes practice in the social world to be able to get a lot of feedback from other peers and other people to get a more solid sense of, okay, this is who I am, this is what I'm all about. So whereas sometimes we feel like, oh my gosh, they're just like hyper social. On the other hand, this is actually a critical window of time for them to be able to learn these adult-like social coping strategies, social skills, an adult-like sense of self socially, and that happens during adolescence. So it's not like we can go, just focus on your studies. You'll just be fine later. You can sort of, find appropriate social things. Just, go into a little huddle and be like isolated and academic. That's not going to help at this stage, because this is the time where the brain actually can start to conceptualize this stuff, and it does that. So if we're saying, hey, just withdraw from a toxic social culture and you'll figure it out later after you've honed your academic skills, well, they're going to learn withdrawal as a way to handle new sort of uncomfortable feelings or new thoughts about how other people are experiencing them. And we want them to actually engage and practice and start to feel confident with who they are. So this is a nice window of time that we actually want to see them lean into social practice, even though sometimes it's of high risk. And so we have to find that balance.
So, Carolyn, one of the things that I heard Dan talking about is the ability to develop those social skills, but it seems like that the social skills, the social aspect, has really high highs or really low lows. There's not a lot of even, or it appears like there's not a lot of even keel during adolescence. So I'm wondering if that's a relationship between all the hormonal changes as well as the brain development changes that are taking place during adolescence, and if that's impacting what we may as parents call as that teenage drama that we sometimes experience?
Yes, well, I think that there is hormone-based, absolutely, but I also know that there's that synapse growth, right, in the prefrontal cortex, and then what happens is it gets pruned, right, which then goes ahead and connects into the limbic system, and it's the limbic brain where you get the social emotional connection and the hyperarousal. So when a teenager has come home and has gotten into a fight with a boyfriend or girlfriend, that's when they kind of explode or are very sad or happy, somewhere in between there. And it's their inability to regulate those emotions. And so they get overwhelmed. And basically in the limbic system, they're learning that, but that comes online, it gets activated initially, but the prefrontal cortex, the ability to be able to regulate and make good judgments and be able to step back and be able to look at a situation, it comes on later in later adolescent, sometimes all the way into 20, 22, 24.
So it seems like those rental car companies who charge you more if you're, or won't rent if you're under 25 knew what they were doing. Since it seems like the brain development supports that.
Right.
So you mentioned something about the ability to regulate and the heightened arousal reward response. So, I mean, it seems like then there's a direct relationship between the developing limbic system and the hyper or heightened sensitivity to arousal, to reward, that may also play a factor in the risk-taking that we see in adolescence as well.
Yes, absolutely. Again, it's that during that time, the peers' influence, whether it's a group of peers or individual peers, really are set the stage for sometimes poor decision making. So if a group of friends are using drugs, alcohol, engaged in sexual behavior, it increases that individual person who's part of that group, their behavior that way, and so of course that include risk behavior, including teen pregnancies, car accidents. You mentioned that with the rental cars, basically really putting the teen at risk.
So related to the at-risk piece, you had also mentioned the part about the synapses and the pruning, and it seems that there's a relationship between the synapses and the pruning of the synapses and the environment that the teen may be in or the person may be in as this is occurring. So I'm wondering what happens if that environment is a little toxic? So for instance, Dan, you might want to talk about this a little bit, is what happens if the teen's experiencing toxic stress, or if they're abusing substances? What happens to the brain in those instances?
So The work of the adolescent brain is to be able to become more adult-like, which means that instead of just having those gut level responses that we can sort of equate with like fight or flight, right? We just, like something happens and whoom, and we're just alarmed or activated in some way. And there's a lot of drama, and we see that for teenagers a lot. Now, theoretically, as adults, our brains, although we experience that, we're able to hold that initial sensation and go to this sort of prefrontal cortex area that we know is later developing up until like the mid-20s. And we want to be able to feel and deal, right? They rhymed that part too, right? So from fight or flight to feel and deal. And as parents, if we're in a like healthy dynamic with our kiddos, and if things are sort of humming along well, then when they have this feel or deal moment as our teens, as our kids, we can help them practice, when they have a fight or flight moment, we help them practice how to like feel, which is just sort of reflecting like what happened, how'd that make you feel on a scale of 1 to 10, things like that help them to just sort of map out their experience. And then deal is making a plan. So they go from just this like reaction to reflecting and planning. That's pretty cool, but that's going to take a long time. We got to do that. We got to practice that a whole ton of times. It's sort of the way little kids have to practice walking a ton of times before they really get it. And in a toxic environment, it's not as easy to get the practice, because when a kiddo gets alarmed and gets into fight or flight mode, one of the challenges is that as parents, we have this sort of mirror reaction. We can see this on a neuron level, right? We can like measure both brains, and the teen brain gets alarmed and the parent brain, whoop, has to deal with a very similar internal feeling. So anytime we're just not on our A game, we're not going to be able to take them through this like, oh, let's feel and deal. We're just going to be in fight or flight mode ourselves. And we can see that a lot. Like our teenagers are great at pushing our buttons, and then we get into these like ever escalating battles where like more and more extreme things are getting said, and really nobody's winning at that point.
So, Carolyn, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the piece about the impact of substances on the developing brain, because I know that, or I've read that it impacts the dopamine receptors a little differently in the developing brain.
Right. Yes. Well, teens that use substances, I believe under the age of 13, there's statistically that they have a greater chance of having substance abuse issues as an adult. And so think about your brain creating all these neurons and synapses and pruning and trying to learn how to regulate the limbic system, the emotional base, and then being able to have good judgment, and then introducing toxic substance to it, and how that would create havoc within the brain and create more lack of judgment and potentially problems with the processing and that brain development during that time. And the increase of use, so then the issue would be is, well, what's normal experimentation, and then what's abuse? And that's definitely, the use of substances and other risk type behaviors are, really definitely concerning with adolescents and need to be looked at carefully to see is it experimentation, or is it actually something that needs to be addressed?
I wonder if there's such a thing as safe risk taking for teens. Dan?
Yes. And add on to that. No, I just want to add on a few other thoughts about boundaries there. And I feel like as far as substance goes, there's some research out now that shows what marijuana specifically, because in Colorado we've got, this sort of loosening of the laws, how that affects the teenage brain. And the study that was done was on people that were long-term users who were using daily, and the activation in this area of the brain that we've been talking about the whole time that we want to kick into gear in adolescence and early adulthood, this is underactivated in people who are daily users. And there's also a correlation, although not necessarily a causation, right? We can't prove this, but there's a correlation between about a drop of IQ points of 15 in that group that has used regularly since adolescence. So we know from the research that's a problem, and we can, sort of extrapolate from there. Now, another interesting piece of research, can I throw this in too? So this is on screen time and what it does to the adolescent brain. And what they found was that multi-screening, which is, I've got my World of Warcraft game here, but I'm watching a movie over here. So like two separate things going on. That is especially bad for the development of our prefrontal cortex. There's no work to be done, because this thing is sort of, all right, in a transition time in my day, I've got to figure out what to do with myself. Get organized, time to make a plan. But if you've got two screens going on, you just never have to like hit that transition. You're just like, and there's no real reason to practice that part of the brain. We're not turning it on. And part of the problem with pruning is that it's not really friendly. It's sort of abides by the law of like, if you don't use it, you lose it. So if we're not practicing this stuff in our late adolescence and early 20s, it's much harder later on in life to suddenly go, all right, time to turn this on.
So you mentioned if we're not practicing it, so what might be some strategies for parents to help them practice some of the things that you're talking about? Practice the feel and deal, practice, well, I don't want to say practice healthy brain development because that doesn't really work, but strategies that really promote healthy brain development in teens.
So your real first question to me about risk taking, there's a great book called The Romance of Risk by Lynn Ponton, and it's about adolescence and how there's a lot of healthiness in being able to test things that were sort of at a younger age just kind of the external boundaries, and to through this process of testing make them internalized, and that there's things where we can get into fight or flight mode for sure, like go sign up for the school play, and that's a healthy risk, because we know they'll be like outside of their comfort zone and having to figure out how to feel and deal. And anytime they're getting that sort of cycle of practice where you've got enough of a challenge where you're a little charged, but there's also not so much difficulty that you can't get that practice of getting your brain to a different place, then you're growing it, and that's a great thing. There's tons of things that we do with teens to help them, get leadership experiences, get after-school things in place that are not just push the academics, but also try to find challenges in other ways that help these important parts of the brain at this time.
Carolyn?
Yeah, and I would add things like sleep. The research says that teens tend to, their body cycles tend to be later than children or adults at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, which probably parents don't want to hear. And also, parents being able to stay grounded and to be able to model good problem solving, asking lots of questions around open-ended questions, being able to continue to, again, be non-judgmental, helping them learn how to observe, describe, a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy skills in order to help these adolescents as they continue to grow have good skill development.
So it sounds like that one of the things that we can do as parents, to address that safe risk-taking thing is encourage kids to maybe, like you said, get out of their comfort zone, to move away from the things that they've always done or that they're really comfortable doing. Maybe take up a new sport or something, those type of activities. So on the flip side to that is, how do we know then as parents if there's something going on? Because I read an article sometimes that a lot of mood disorders are diagnosed in that late adolescence period. So how do we know if there's something going on that's either not normal developmental processes where we might want to seek out additional help? I've worked a lot of years as a juvenile probation officer, so I see the extreme cases of not only with the mental health issues, but also the more antisocial conduct disorder behaviors. And what seems to happen is there's multiple risk behavior going at the same time. So you may have
substance using, maybe getting involved in some delinquent behavior. So you'll have multiple things going on at the same time. And that's definitely one thing to look for. Also, isolation, changes in behavior that, if they're going along a certain trajectory in their development, and each adolescent develops differently and in their own timetable. But if you see that, and then there's, the isolation or different types of behaviors that are presenting, that would be a good indicator to get some outside consultation to see if there's something else going on.
Okay. Dan?
Boy, I sometimes use this ridiculous analogy. So if we as grown-ups, I know it's ridiculous, I'm sorry in advance, but if we as grown-ups suddenly had a new arm, like we wake up one morning and there's like an extra arm coming out of our back, it would be really awkward for a while. And how like little babies can't like move their body right because the neural connections aren't there to actually go, okay, intention this way, let's see what happens and make it move, right? They get hitting themselves and things like that. And if we had a new arm, first we would be obsessed with it, right? Because we'd be like, oh my gosh, like what's this thing doing? And it would be pretty awkward. We wouldn't be really good with like having it like bear its load. So I feel like this is what happens to teens with like new brain skills. It's like their brain is actually different. They don't have a kid brain anymore. They have an adult brain that hasn't been practiced. It's like a new arm. And a lot of times, like there's a range of normal in terms of adolescent behavior that's not really like acceptable or functional long term, but is just sort of like what we might expect from somebody bonking themselves with a new arm. Like yeah, your emotional landscape has expanded, and it's hard to kind of regulate that. It's hard to like regulate sleep-wake cycle, peer pressure, balancing all these pressures from school and home life and all that, and putting your dishes in the dishwasher. Like all these things are sort of hard to manage from the teenage brain. And one of the things that we see is that a younger brain is sometimes more functional. And there's this great book called Yes, Your Teen is Crazy by Michael Bradley, and it's about how the adolescent brain, because it has these new skills, is just more heavily burdened by just trying to sort through the new content of its day. So the external performance or the like social awareness is limited and less than it was a couple years earlier when the world was a little more simplified.
Great. So I know that it seems hard to believe, but we're getting close to the end of our time. And so what I'd like to do is offer each of you 2 minutes to talk about anything that you feel we haven't covered yet in the teen brain that you think it's really important for parents to know. Dan.
Nice. Boy, I feel like the really common questions that I get asked are around those edges of like, my kid has gotten more out of hand. How do I control this, right? Because at a younger age, when they're 11 or 12 or 9, 7, there's a real appropriate level of having these very concrete boundaries. And a good example is that commercial when I was a kid that was, this is your brain on drugs, with the frying pan and the egg, and then they say, see the difference in the eggs frying, and it's like, oh, that's terrible, terrible. And any 9-year-old kid will look at that and go, oh, terrible, terrible. And if you ask them, they'll go, I'll never do drugs. But suddenly when they're 14 or 16, there's like a very different story getting told. And I feel like as parents, we have to level up that the sort of black and white concrete message of say no to drugs with the frying pan is great for a 9-year-old. But if you say that to a 15-year-old, well, they're also watching Comedy Central, and they're getting messages from music and movies and their friends and the legal system. And those messages aren't saying, just say no, look at this poor overcooked egg, that's what's going to happen to your brain. So there's this importance in being able to sort of dive into the mix of the problem and to go into these abstract ways of thinking with our kids, because now they can kind of hold, like, when we're young, little cartoons where it's like good characters, evil characters. That makes sense to a concrete brain. But now as teenagers, it's like they like Spider-Man because the kid sort of is like, kind of good, but has these sort of like, selfish tendencies, and that feels more to their, the stuff in their brain that is really getting interesting for them and what they really want to kind of sort out. So, I don't know, I guess I'll stop there because I think I'm at 2 minutes, but we could talk more about Spider-Man if...
Okay. Carolyn?
Well, my kids are all grown, and I wish I would have known, I guess, as a parent, the more about the brain, that in raising teenagers and some of the decisions I made as a parent, I would probably do different. Like one of my kids, I let him use the car, and he went out and got into an accident and didn't tell us about it. And knowing what I know now as an older parent, about the decision making, the risk taking, the not thinking, all of the pieces that go into it, I really should have known that this probably would have happened. And I think that that's the piece I'd like to tell parents, is that really the importance of understanding that it's really, as Dan, you were saying, it's really about, they have this whole new brain and they don't know what's going on. They have all of these different things that are hitting them, social peers, which are very, very important. And then trying to manage all of these things when a lot of times society does treat teenagers like they're more adult-like, when in fact they're in the process of developing and growth and growing into hopefully a well-balanced adult. And so just really to take that into consideration as they raise their kids.
Great. Dan?
I just had a thought about one of the things that I think gets in the way of what we're trying to accomplish is when we see our kiddo get off track with risk-taking behavior. Wrecking the car, I think, is a great example because we'll all be like so furious. And the problem with that fury is that, and there could be that, a whole bunch of different ways. You said you were going to do your homework, you didn't do your homework, and we need to relate to that, and we want to be able to hold them accountable. And if we put them into a little bit of fight or flight, well, so be it. But we don't want to be so furious that we can't actually get to that cycle of like, okay, how do you really like think about what happened, reflect on it, and make a plan for the next time? Because when we get too frustrated, I feel like it interrupts that cycle of practice that's needed. Like, this is a developmental skill they have to learn. It's not just that like they're unmotivated and so they messed up or they're wanting to personally betray you. It's like, it's hard to manage all of this stuff. And likewise, like a little kid who's learning how to walk, that's a developmental skill. And we can't go, I told you, one foot in front of the other, and look what you did. You fell. Like, that's just not helpful at all. We want them to keep getting up and continue to practice. And so we have to kind of find that way of like not too loose, not too tight, engaging them so they can go through those steps of not just leaving it in a gut level place, but feeling and dealing. And if we get triggered, we can always come back an hour later, a day later. That's totally fine, and help them through it.
It seems like one of the things that's really important to remember is that we expect as teens get older that they understand the consequences of what it is, of the decision that they make. And they might not really have realized what those consequences would be because the part of their brain that's controlling those executive functions is still developing. I think that that's a really important thing for us as adults in general to remember. So we're just about out of time. I'd like to go ahead and thank our partners and sponsors, particularly the Boulder Valley School District and BV Channel 22, without whom this series would not be possible. In addition, I'd also like to thank the Daily Camera, Centennial Peaks Hospital, Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance, Boulder Counseling Cooperative, and the Temple Grandin School. If you're interested in knowing about additional talks, the Boulder Psychological Services website has a listing of any of the upcoming television shows, the upcoming in-person talks at the libraries, and there's a series of webinars that are available. You can go to boulderpsychologicalservices.com, and as you can see on the screen, there's a wealth of information that's available for you by going through that website. I'd like to thank everybody who is in our audience today, and I'd like to thank our panelists for being here, and have a good day.
Now the planet's done its bowing down, and soon the growth returns to follow ground. But I know what's churning underneath beneath the snow. And I love my baby, and we've miles to go. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Be with me. We'll beat this, can't you see? So wait a while, winter time. Wait a while, winter time.